Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 57, Seeing Art, Alteration, Recreation, and Redesign. Hello, everybody. Welcome into this wonderful Education Friday, and this is the Takeup. I am Eric Campbell, one-time, long-time digitizer, embroiderer, e-commerce manager, and lover of all things thread. And I'm happy to have you guys here to talk once again about digitizing. I know I have promised you guys some business shows as well. I know I have something about ideal customers that people have been pestering me about, but last week we did a lot of talk about deconstructing designs. We went full 2 hours. I'm going to warn you today, I'm not planning on that much bonus time, but I do have a big subject. We'll see how it turns out. In any case, I will get back to some business content too. The guys who love digitizing, the folks out there who really want to talk about art, you're going to love today more, maybe next time not as much, but we'll balance back and forth doing a little bit of both. What I will say is the votes are in. Design deconstructions are definitely on the menu for future episodes. You guys want to see more design deconstruction, design reconstruction, digitizing, and working out how files were created, what designs I made artistically, or what decisions I made artistically in designs, and I can hear that loud and clear. So that's definitely going to come up. We'll have more of that. Today will be a lot about how we look at art and how we decide what shapes we are going to create from art, and some things we can do to help us see our art in a way that makes sense for embroidery. So really, it's somewhat about what model, what method we take in our decisions about preparing art for embroidery. It's a little bit about how we look at art, what we can do to art to get our best out of it. What do we do when we have poor art in front of us? What do we do when we have detailed art, full color art, photographic art, things like that? How are we going to handle that? How are we going to find our lines, our core curves, our shapes, our nodes? And what does that mean in the scheme of interpretation? Like when we see a piece of art in, when we get something in, how are we going to make that work? How are we going to find what we need as digitizers to literally just draw the line? To draw the lines, to find out where the shapes are supposed to go, to decide where we're putting things, maybe to decide also things like color palettes and the like. Like I said, we might not get to all of this today. I'm not planning on going a full 2 hours. We'll see how it goes. But I will talk about all of this because the questions have been hot and heavy, fast and furious ever since we did the design deconstruction. What I am going to say, though, is we have neglected a couple things that I used to do, which were I used to do the moment of meme. I used to do some embroidery memes every time. I'm going to go ahead and throw a couple on that people sent me because they did take the time to send these in. Unfortunately, I don't have names on these. I had a couple of fairly anonymous ones in my email, but you know what? Let's go ahead and send these on, and I'll actually comment on these. So a couple memes before we get started, and I'll say hi to some folks. First one is this one: left embroidery machine while sewing while I left the room. Thread didn't break. So yeah, old school meme. I'm going to say this. I'm not much for leaving the machine running in a room without me. And I used to be a watcher. As you guys know, I used to watch machines that didn't have thread break sensors. So yeah, that would be a heck of a win for me because back in the day, we used to watch 212 heads that didn't have thread break sensors. And believe me, I wouldn't be walking around just hoping for that thread break not to happen. And the other one was somebody actually sent me a patch that someone made. And I love this, by the way. This is probably not the context, but all digitizers have either said this to someone else, all embroiderers have heard this from a digitizer and had different feelings about it. And this is the patch they sent me in. Works on my machine. I don't know. I'm going to say, yeah, this is often the case between digitizers and embroiderers where the digitizer will run out a sample and it looks good. Embroiderer runs a sample and it doesn't. All it says to me is that we do need to think about the holistic nature of embroidery, that the execution is a big part of everything that's going on, and that how we run things, how we hoop, what stabilizer we use, how fast we run, the thread we're running, our tensions can affect the outcome. And especially, let's say this, it can be the embroiderer who's doing something weird. It can be the digitizer doing something weird. Digitizers, if you sample only on super stable materials with no grain that doesn't stretch and has no texture, not going to help a lot when the customer goes and puts it on a 6-panel hat with a corduroy front. Now, I haven't seen a lot of 6-panel hats with corduroy fronts, but it certainly would change the way that design turned out. And embroiderers, if your digitizer has done something for, let's say you told them you were running on a sports shirt and they did it for a cotton piqué polo and you take it home and put it on corduroy pants, that might be up to you. You may have to talk to them about what you need the best. So we all have something to learn from that. Anyway, let's go ahead and grab some comments and let you know some other stuff that's going on. Number one, links for this episode. A lot of these links, once again, links are not always directly in the stream of the episode. They're not exactly a copy of anything that's happening while I'm teaching here. But what they usually have in them are some supplementary information. This one has some cool books to look at. It has a drawing challenge I'm going to talk about briefly. It has some posts from me so you can see my semi-abysmal drawing skills. And there are some posts about some of the topics that we're going to talk about some graphical operators we're going to use, and some classes that I really like, as well as just some fonts I'm going to discuss because we're going to talk about typefaces again. Hey, no, no big surprise there. And an episode that I really think you should look at. If you're concerned about doing interpretation and trying to figure out what shapes you need to make out of things, one of the big things with that is developing an eye for machine embroidery. It's episode 22 of the Takeup, where I discuss what it means to develop the eye. We're going to talk about this again during the process of all this, but what it means to look at objects in your world, look at art in your world, and have an eye for how they would be embroidered immediately, how to develop that. And it's knowledge of embroidery, knowledge of the shapes themselves, knowledge of how to build things. And we're going to talk about that as we go on today. So that's all in the links list there. You'll find it in the top comment. So it's in the top comment, but it's also here at this link. With that, let's grab a couple of comments from everybody who's coming in because we have some people already jumping. We have Jeff Fuller of Embroidery Nerd. Hello, Jeff. Happy to see you here. Lots of buzz going on about all the great stuff Jeff's doing. Frank Dunn, good evening all out in the UK. Happy to see you here. Kathleen, hi, happy Friday. Happy to see you in, Kathleen, as well. Glad to be doing Education Friday with you all, as we do. Clarinda says hello. Hello, Clarinda. Yosta from Sweden coming in again. Hi, happy to have you here. Hi from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where it is warming up, but we have high winds from all the changes out here. I know we do the weather report sometimes, but that's how we were doing. Audrey's just present, so hands up present. I know sometimes you guys say this is class. I don't intend it to be a class, but hey, I guess it's class. Ramona says, FYI, marketing new product lines for a future show. Yeah, no, we can talk about that. Like I said, I want to talk about ideal customers for one. They're especially ideal customers for embroidery, e-commerce, and company stores. It's a big thing. I'm actually teaching on that as well. So I'm going to try not to stomp all over the stuff that people are paying to see. However, I do want to give you guys some discussions about that stuff. It's a big deal. Regina says, good afternoon. I love this topic. I hope I do it justice. Like I said, there's so much to cover. There's so much to cover in this topic that I will get into little bits and pieces. It won't be the last time. What I've realized is, and guys, you can tell me if you're wrong, if I'm wrong here, I used to be very worried every time I did an episode that I'd covered the same ground earlier in a previous episode. And if you look through the episodes, I really try not to cover the same ground all the time. What I will say is I've learned over time that people need some of this information more than once. It's like the marketing thing we always say, 7 to 10 touches, 7 to 10 exposures to something before someone takes an action or really remembers it. Number one. Number two, that some of this information coming together in different ways from different angles with different examples may be helpful to people or hit people at different times. Number three, we have people like Jenny here. And hi, Jenny. Happy to have you here. I had you here earlier on in the half where you came in and talked with us. People who are here for the first time, and they may be getting some of this information from, the very first moment. They're just coming in and finding this stuff out. So, that's something that we have to remember. People come to this either new to embroidery or new to the channel at all these different times, and they be coming in for the live show. And I think it's great for them to see some of the critical information, especially when, like this week, I have had my email and my personal messages bombarded with questions about interpreting art. After last week's show, there were plenty of people who wanted to talk about interpreting art. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I will do new stuff all the time. I will try and look for new things. I may even have interviews, something I want to do in the Takeup. I may do it in other places, but I've got some really cool people who are going to come in, as well as, some different topics, some different things we haven't covered, but things like art interpretations, digitizing for small lettering, dealing with foam, patches. These are things that people want to know. Applique over and over. And we can find new little angles for each thing that we're doing. And we can talk about it from different methods, means, and also literally with different examples involved. So when you guys have questions, ask questions. Feel free to ask here. And seriously, no matter what your question is, pardon me for the mic fry there, no matter what your question is, I want to hear it. Ask in the comments today, ask anytime in between, go ahead and hit me up, and it will be useful. Even if you think someone's already asked, ask the question anyway, because you may have a new angle, something that people haven't seen, or it might just be the right time for the refresher for the rest of us. So Justin's saying, hello all, happy to have Justin here. Justin meant to digitizer himself, a really good digitizer as well. So if you're looking for one, there's one who's there. B-Thrash, hey, everybody. Nice day in South Carolina today. Happy to have you in. And nice day here in Albuquerque, too, I'd say. It's quite nice. Hello to Mike Muldowney. Guten Abend, depending on where you are. Guten Tag. Jorita says hello. Hello, Eric. Hello, Joe Rita. Happy to have you there. Lori's here, and Jorita weighs in and says, repeats are excellent. You forget where you saw a certain item. Yeah, I think honestly, the other thing is we refresh ourselves. I know I've shared a couple of my kind of memories from Facebook in the last year of techniques that I was showing people and things that I was working out, and I'm super glad that Facebook put those up because there were some techniques like using the triple whip stitch and making kind of faceted lettering. I may review that again. It's something that I talked about in the show like way early on, but a year earlier, especially with everything this went on in this year, I'll say that I did not follow that down and track it down enough to finish what I wanted to do with it. So, it's something that I'm looking for. Anyway, so yeah, repeats are excellent. I'm glad to hear that sometimes. And Audrey says, listening and learning, so I'm prepped for retirement 2 years and do what I really want to do, digitize. Hey, you know what? Lots of people have done this as a secondary career, and I'm all about it. No matter what stage you are, where you're coming from, if you're coming from craft, if you're coming from the commercial world, I'm here for this, especially for digitizing. Digitizing is digitizing is digitizing. We have different things that we might think of as more important. We might be more inclined to do artistic work, more inclined to do more efficient work. We might be willing to use more or less materials, thread colors, multimedia, whatever, because of the way we're doing things, because we're doing things for commercial reproduction or individual pieces or art. I have everyone from the full-on craft side and hobbyists to thread artists, people who are fiber artists who are doing things to hang in galleries, to people like me who came from a really logo-based commercial background who tune in, and I am super happy that there's something I can give to all you guys. And if there's something I'm giving that's good for you, that's good for me. And I want you all here. So glad to have you all here. Last couple hellos, and then we'll get on to the meat of the matter today. Letty Walker says, hi, guys. Hi, Letty. Happy to have you in. Marta Caffrey comes in and says, listening as you drive. Well, I hope I don't say anything too controversial and run you off the road. Do be careful while you're out there. And Clarinda from Roswell comes in. Roswell, New Mexico. That's cool. I am from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and born and bred. So it's one of those things that gets into your blood, New Mexico. If you haven't been out here, by all means, come out here. And hopefully, when all of this settles down and is over, we'll have the balloon fiesta again, and I'll see some of your shining faces out here watching the hot air balloons go up. So with that, guys, let's actually get into it. We actually have something to talk about today, right? We have a few things. Number one, I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see what's going on. First thing is, this is the links list. Like I said earlier, you'll find all those links we talked about. We will actually be discussing some of these items that are in here as we go on through the day. But we will generally be talking, it's more lecture stuff today and some examples, because I do absolutely have some example materials up. We're going to look at stuff in the software for sure. You can see my little ribbon down there. We're going to look at some stuff in software. We're going to look at some stuff on art software. We're going to be looking in some photograph software. We're going to be all over the board, and we might even see some slides. So lots of stuff going on today. We'll see how much of it we get into, but here's hoping that we get into plenty of it. In any case, guys, let's go ahead and get back to the actual list and what we're working on. So first thing, we are talking about interpreting art. There are two things I want to cover briefly, and this is the two kind of facets of the way I see people using art. Because I've been talking to people about how they handle incoming art and what it means for their digitizing, I feel like it's worthwhile kind of defining this. The first one I'm going to essentially call traditional digitizing, and I'm calling it that for a couple different reasons. Number one, if we go back early enough to punchers, they were doing stuff from pre-prepared art. And in fact, we're talking about punchers, people who are literally doing things one stitch at a time. They were actually taking the art and it was being redrawn as something almost like an architectural map called a cartoon that was a 6:1 ratio enlargement, because they were up on the wall doing this with really big, magnetic boards eventually, but depending on the tool, whatever, they were using that really large redrawn piece to work on. And then the traditional side of that is that the art is prepared before the digitizing. Now, cartooning is to the point where stitch angles, shapes, everything is already defined, in a hard copy before you do the punching. But for us, we aren't talking that really, because we're going to draw stuff in our digitizing software. We're going to be able to use our vector-like working file objects to get things done. So when I'm talking about traditional digitizing, in my point of view, it is that I have reasonably prepared art, or at least I have the art in a state that I'm willing to digitize from, which depending on the art, we'll talk about that. You can do things with redrawing or without redrawing. You can redraw your pieces or draw your shapes even on poor art in your software, or you can do it previously in art format. So when I'm talking about traditional digitizing, all I mean is that the art comes in and we draw on top of the art. We draw our embroidered shapes on the art. We're not bringing in other art. We're not bringing in finished vector and trying to use that or convert it. We're bringing in art as a backdrop, or at least as the intention being that it's a backdrop, knowing that we're going to draw our embroidery shapes on top. So that's the first thing. Traditional digitizing, as I will define it here, is that we're going to bring in some sort of backdrop, some sort of art. We're going to draw embroidery shapes on top of it, generally shapes that are meant entirely for embroidery. We're not going to be reusing shapes from print. I'm just going to say from the get-go, I tend to recommend traditional digitizing whenever anyone is trying to actually digitize something of any detail, when you're trying to do anything more than just reproduce shapes, and if it's going to have any sort of registration, two items that have to be close together and stay close together once you're stitching them. I want to draw shapes that are specific to the embroidery. I'm going to draw in pull compensation, push compensation, and I'm going to draw those in and use settings to get closer when I have to work with different fabrics. I'm not going to let those overlaps be dictated by settings. I'm not going to draw things with perfect borders, edge to edge, and then have my settings deal with the overlap when I'm talking about pull compensation. I'm going to draw, underlay, and overlay areas the way they need to be for pull comp in the actual shapes, in the embroidered shapes. Traditional digitizing. So with that defined, it tells you immediately that we're going to be doing some sort of redrawing and rework if we're using this method anyway. No matter what art comes in, we're going to redraw. And this is why when you talk to digitizers like me, who started that way and tend to work that way, when you give them bad art, yes, they kind of care, because if art is so bad I can't see the borders of it, especially if something is very geometric, if it's custom text where it has to have a clean edge, even though the art you're given doesn't have a clean edge, that there should be a clean edge there that you really can't see. If I can't define the edge of a shape, if I can't define the borders between areas of color, and they are meant to have borders, especially if it's something graphical like that. We're not talking about, if it's watercolor and everything is meshed together and that's the point, then okay, we can futz with that. There's something we can do there. When we're talking about something graphical, logos, text, anything geometric, if I can't define those edges, then the art is too poor for me to use. Otherwise, as embroiderers, as digitizers, we are also drawing for our embroidered shapes when we're doing that traditional work. And the concept is we're going to essentially be redrawing it anyway, as long as we are in the ballpark and we can see what we're doing. Most of the time, most art's going to be okay. And the old joke was always that we drew from the cocktail napkin, and that was the joke that somebody in the bar draws a logo with a cocktail napkin, and we're going to redraw and make it work. Everybody says that's a joke. However, I have actually received a napkin with a sketch on it for the concept. The thing is, though we make the cocktail napkin joke, we're never really digitizing the thing on the cocktail napkin. When you get something like that, it's usually a piece of concept work. And even if this is not necessarily the realm of most digitizers, what you're actually being asked to do is design something based on the concept. That is a different kind of work. It still, in my opinion, goes into traditional digitizing, because what I'm going to actually be doing is designing a piece that would be worthwhile to print, and then I'm going to be drawing the shapes for embroidery anyway after the fact. And that's kind of the traditional digitizing steps. If I need to rework something, if the original piece that I have is not ready to digitize from, if it needs to be laid out differently, if some text is much too small but still needs to be present in the final design, I'm going to rework that first before I digitize. I'm going to make sure my layout is what it is, or I'm going to know that rework is going to happen, and when I redraw my shapes in digitizing, I'm going to do it knowing that I'm changing scale, knowing that I'm changing position, and I'm going to move things around in my digitizing software when I work them. But no matter what I'm doing, I'm drawing shapes that I need for embroidery on top of the art. I'm not necessarily making the art and then importing the art and trying to convert shapes that exist. And I would consider that vector rework digitizing. It's not really digitizing the way that I would call traditional. That's when somebody gives you an SVG file, EPS file, AA file, you convert it into whatever vector your software will take. SVG is pretty universal these days. Didn't used to be that case. You bring it into your software, and then you're going to start breaking up the shapes in order to make something that works for embroidery. That generally is a different kind of process. And I find that for me, most of the time, I would rather do this. I'd rather go back to traditional digitizing, draw my own shapes, because a letter may be made up of 9 pieces. The outline, and this is something I'm going to say in general, and this will come up again later. The silhouette of a shape is almost never the embroidered shape you need. Only if you are making the edge of an applique, if you're making the edge of a patch or an area that's very simple, maybe that's the embroidered shape you need, and that doesn't really even account for distortion. A letter A even in the simplest block, is very likely to be made up of 3 satin stitch blocks that are going to have to be drawn separately or at least broken out. And because they overlap in certain ways, if you tried to cut them apart, you're going to end up modifying at least one of the shapes fairly extensively, even on a block font. The silhouette you're looking at in vector is almost never the embroidered shapes you need to make the file work. So with that being the case, why people are very obsessed with bringing in vector directly or doing a lot of work in vector and then bringing the vector shapes in, I don't know. Most of the time, the tools that are in your actual embroidery software are going to be made for the stitch that they're made to create, or they are going to inform that stitch somehow. And you're going to be doing rework that may or may not be awesome. And also, not all software brings in all vector formats equally, or equally, let's say, with equal fidelity. So it may not be the right way to move in the first place. I'm going to say traditional digitizing is usually the way for me. So when we're talking about interpreting art like the stuff I've shown you, number one, most of it I had wasn't in vector. Most of the stuff came in raster or hard copy. When you have raster, that means anything that's made of dots, bitmaps, pixels, JPEGs, ping files, PNGs, however you say it. By the way, I also say GIF, not GIF, so sue me. Whatever kind of file you have that has dots, that's a raster file. When you bring it in, you're going to have to redraw that anyway. But that's also, I'm not going to be using any sort of automatic drawing generally. I'm not going to be using any sort of automatic conversion or tracing for the most part, because most of those things, the shapes won't be what I need anyway. So I'm going to get a cleaner line if I draw the line myself, which means we do have to know a little bit about drawing. If you're digitizing, you're going to know how to draw with your drawing tools. 100%, you're going to need to learn how to use either the spline or the Bezier curve tools. You're going to have to use them at least well enough to make the kind of shapes you need for embroidery at the level you're working at. It's just what it is. You can do things like break up text. You can do editing instead, and sometimes it's easier to break up a font. I often start a font out with a true type source and then start breaking things up and remaking things. Totally fine to do. However, you are going to have to learn how to at least manipulate curves to a point to make this happen. No matter what software you're in, at the very least, you will have spline editing, which is where you drop a bunch of curves and corner points, and then the line tries to travel through them in the best way that it possibly can. It's still eventually going to take editing, and you're going to have to learn how to manipulate that line. That's just 100% what's going to happen. So let's start talking about this kind of the interpretation stuff. Number one, I'll show you that even in the little brand image, the image that I showed you guys before as the header for the Takeup today, you'll see over on the left-hand side of that, there is a sketch. This is kind of the proverbial napkin. When I'm talking about working from a sketch, this is not always the case, but sometimes you will have people who literally just do this. They're like, I want an outline of the state of New Mexico. I want a Z shape. Here's the lights and this, and here's the lettering I want. When you have somebody like this, that's really a design job. That is not the same as any sort of just standard digitizing job, and we should probably understand that. We're going to be designing stuff, and that's a different method. And honestly, this may be the case where we tell people, hey, you should have that designed before I touch it, or hey, I need to charge you for design work because I'm actually going to be drawing up the thing that you want. As you can see there, I did indeed recreate and make a design that was functional out of what they gave me, but you can also see I took some artistic license and had them approve it. Whereas if you look at on the right-hand side, something we're actually going to cover more, there is actually working from a really poor JPEG source from something and then having to make something I could digitize from because I couldn't get a good flat image of the piece that I was working from. And on the bottom, we have working from a photograph, and how am I going to deal with the fact that I'm using limited colors to reproduce something that's photographic. Now, in this case, it's a really simple design. The piece itself was a bronze sculpture, so it didn't have much color or much depth to it in the first place. But that's where I'm trying to show you how you can identify shapes to make it work. So we're going to talk about all these different things as we get going. Let's see, we've got a comment in here, and I actually want to bring this in from Regina because I like this very much. I like vector for resizing and then use traditional digitizing. Also, it tends to be more reliable for colors. Yeah. And I'll say this. The pieces I'm going to show you, on multiple occasions, I have done my drawing in vector before I go to embroidery. So that's another thing. Plus, if you learn how to use Bezier curves, especially if your software like a Stitch Artist has a method, its mode is very much in step with the way graphic arts tools work. If you learn how to digitize shapes there, you will be able to grasp vector better and you can be able to draw vector. And actually, I'm going to show you a couple of resources that I use to get better at vector, despite the fact that I've drawn vector most of my career. I've started out using all kinds of spline tools and also what I would call old school traditional embroidery digitizing tools where this is almost previous to vector, and the tools themselves, the way of drawing was locked to the kind of stitch you were using. So you weren't drawing normal vectors, you were drawing different kind of shapes. And honestly, the remnants of those are still in all digitizing tools. If you look at, like, say, two-sided column entry where you do the ladder steps, where you go left side, right side, left side, right side, that is absolutely a direct descendant of how you enter column stitches or steel stitches, whatever they're called in your particular software, back in the days of punching. So I will agree. So I'll go with Regina and say, yeah, I like to draw in vector because it allows you to resize things, move things around, and no matter what scale they're at, you get a clean line on your output. But I'm going to say this, frequently enough, I have output a raster file and brought that in, output something like a PNG or JPEG, and brought that into my software and drawn from that. Because it just keeps you from the bad habit of taking the non-embroidery art that you've made that is good. It's a good piece of art. It's nice and clean, but isn't for embroidery. It stops you from wanting to convert it. Because honestly, sometimes I don't want to convert shapes when I'm looking at stuff. I really don't. So let's go back into kind of the discussion of this stuff. We talked about traditional digitizing, talked about vector rework, but here's the first thing I'm going to say. I'm going to remind you guys what I talked about when we're talking about dealing with customer expectations of artwork, because it's still important here. And this is the same kind of questions you're going to ask a customer about a piece of artwork that you're going to work on, about a design that they want. There's the kind of things you'll ask yourself when you are redesigning, reworking, trying to figure out how to use a particular piece of art or an element. And these are the things that I want you to ask yourself. Number one, what's important? When you're looking at a piece, what's important? What needs to be there? Usually you're going to ask a customer about this if it's something that is customer focused. If it's artwork that you're doing for yourself, you're going to look at it and say, okay, what's the most important element here? And what about this image that's in front of me defines the art? What defines the piece? What elements can I not take away without making it not look like itself? Or what elements are emblematic of the art, of the text? Like, we're going to talk about that in just a second. If you're looking at a font, what pieces of the font, what things that are on each of the letters, what strokes, what parts of the character, what make up the character of it? And I mean the look of it, and need to be represented in order for this thing to look like the font I'm starting from. What needs to be there for this logo to look like itself, for it to be identifiable as what it is, and to carry the same style as the print art that's in front of me? What defines the art? And for a customer, what's important? What's it going to do? This is also when we talk about small text and say, hey, if you can't read it from 3 feet away, do we really need it? Or does it need to be bigger? What is important? What is it here to do? The other thing we have to worry about is this thing. And I'm actually going to bring up a topic about this. When I see people drawing their pieces, sometimes they get tripped up, not because the art is so poor, but because they're trying to draw things that they imagine should be there but are not. And it's a problem with art. And I'm not saying I'm a fine artist. By no means am I a fine artist, or even, I would say, a skilled designer. Do I design? Yes, I have done design work. Am I a skilled designer? No, I'm a self-taught designer who does not have a degree behind me. However, this is the problem I see with people who are drawing things. They need to draw what's there, not what should be. Number one, when they're drawing things, then the next thing they actually have to do for embroidery is to suggest what is there rather than drawing every little line. We still have to maintain ourselves within our medium. We have embroidery which has lines of a thickness that can't be changed. Thread cannot be made thinner aside from literally using thinner thread. And even that has a limit. And it will always be thread. It will always be an object. It does not blend. It does not smear. We have to use it as what it is. It has to be thread. Also, there is a shortest stitch we can run with any given needle thread combination. So we have to only put in the detail that we have to put in order to get what we need, right? What defines the art. But the other thing is we have to draw what's there and not what should be there. If you have a struggle with this, it's the thing I always talk about. If you're drawing a tree or a chair, the thing is, in your mind, I can hold a three-dimensional chair and look at it from several angles all at the same time. If I try and draw a chair from memory, I may draw it all out of perspective and looking weird, because I'm going to try and represent the entirety of what a chair is. I'm not going to represent what it looks like looking when I'm looking at it from one angle like it would be in real life necessarily. And if I try and draw the idealized version of the chair, I may not get it right. Sometimes we'll draw faces and we'll draw these idealized eyes, this idealized nose that looks weird. It's what kids do. It's this iconic representation of things not realistic. So we want to draw what's there, not what should be there. And that's why I put on the links list. And we'll go ahead and pop that up real quick. First thing I put on there is this book. It's been around forever, but I think it's still useful to people. It's called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And some of the tricks from drawing on the right side of the brain will help you to get out of your own way with drawing. One of the things I've done before when I'm having a lot of difficulty is to turn an image upside down or even digitize upside down. In fact, I've taught people to digitize letters who are having trouble by giving them characters from an alphabet that they don't know, so that they just start thinking of things as shape, as line, as value, and not as the object. If you try and digitize a face too hard, if you work too hard at digitizing a face, you may misrepresent it. You have to draw the lines that are there. Now, usually we are tracing. We're working on top of art, and that's fine. But when we're working with this extremely poor art, we will sometimes start to invent things that aren't really there and will cause ourselves trouble. So when you're drawing new items for yourself, or if you're just trying to figure something out and you can't really see something that's there, try your best to draw what's there and not what should be there. Now, it's usually not a problem for us, but because it's something that does come up, I thought it'd be worthwhile to give people a look at this. And it's a book that helped me in drawing objects and trying to realize, sometimes I'm trying to work something in that's not really there, and I need to focus on the shapes that are there. And the reason I bring that up is also because a lot of people want to talk about the piece that I worked on last week. And this piece specifically is the cover that we worked on, that I did, this magazine cover of the carousel. I'm not going to go deep into it again this time, but one of the things that happened is people, when you see it, you guys can see even here in this art that there is a reflected carousel horse in this mirror back here. And I'm going to tell you, when I was first trying to do this piece, this area back here, I started by trying to make this horse happen. The thing is, the only way it finally got to the point where it actually looks like a reflection of a carousel horse is when I stopped trying to make the dang thing a horse and started drawing the fields of color that were actually there. And I'll go ahead and bring up the actual piece real quick over top of everything. Here's the overlay. And you can see that there's this you can see the bridge of the nose of the horse and kind of the bit, and that the head has this kind of flat area in the front of it. And you can see these shapes that are in the window as a reflection. The only way I was able to make them actually come out and be anything noticeable or have any kind of interesting texture really had to do with getting out of my own head and saying, all right, I can see that there are areas of color. I can see where there is color. I can see where there's not color. And this is how I would represent this with thread. Letting it be abstract and drawing the objects that are there is how I got past it. If I keep trying to draw a horse here, I'm going to add parts. I'm going to add the nose, add the mouth, and it's going to look like a weird cartoon. It's not going to look like the thing that's there, because what is there is a very dim reflection. And it's actually not a mirror. It's an empty shadow box. There's a dim reflection over black of one of the carousel horses. And when I first started working on it, I didn't know it was there. But then when I did start to see it coming out, then my head got full of the idea that there's a horse here, and I started wanting to change those shapes. And I had to stop and go, okay, just draw what's there. Don't draw what should be there. Draw the pieces that are there in front of you, and don't worry about what they are. Yours is not to necessarily know what they are when we're at this stage, especially when we're talking about a very abstract shape that is not supposed to be idealized. I mean, don't get me wrong. When we start to work in the horse itself, I'm definitely going to tell you, I've told you before, in fact, I talked about anatomy. We've got the horse's teeth are separate. Now, this is also a big fiberglass mold, so the anatomy is not perfect. But as you can see, certainly we have different stitch directions based on the different parts of the anatomy of the horse that are there. So knowing what the horse is and the parts of the horse are great for this main object. But when we're having trouble with things like shading, when we're having trouble with things that are more abstract, one of the best things we can do is to get out of our way is to draw what's actually in the image, especially with photographic pieces. We can draw what's there and not what we imagine to be there, and we're going to get a better result out of that. I think we got a couple comments here, so let me bring a couple of those in there. And yeah, I will absolutely agree with this. Lori says that would be a Picasso chair. Yes. When we look at things like that, like cubism and surrealism, these are like concepts in our mind that don't really exist in front of us. And yeah, you end up drawing a chair where all the legs are in the same angle and same field, and everything's parallel in a way that doesn't happen in real life. We don't have any vanishing points. We don't have any perspective. Like I said, I'm not going to say I'm awesome at it. I'm definitely not. I have to really work to make myself draw, and I'll show you some of my drawings that I did a while back. But, I have to work to make myself draw, and I'm usually tracing over something that's already there. What I will say is the knowledge that we're trying to draw what's there and not what should be there is still useful. And Justin Armenta, digitizer himself, says, that's my problem. I draw on the wrong side side of the brain, yeah, we try and draw with this definition on our head in the left side of the brain. And the sidedness of the brain is scientifically is a thing we can get into, but suffice it to say, it may or may not be true. The concept is we have this rational side and this creative side without worrying about the actual hemispheres of your brain. The truth is we will start to define a thing and try and draw it based on these definitions rather than drawing what's actually there in front of us. And with digitizers, if we're doing this traditional method, especially, we're not designing it ourselves, we're usually looking at a piece that we're tracing and we get in our own way more than we do any good if we're trying to not draw stuff that's not there necessarily. Aside from the fact that when I'm teaching you guys about like getting dimension, certainly we're imagining lines that aren't in the art, and that's true. But we're also using the art that's there to help us understand where those lines are. It's where we're doing stuff that's photographic, that's fuzzy, that's hard to tie back. And turn into something outlined like that is definitely where I think it's helpful to say, okay, stop for a minute, even if you go and change it later. And by the way, I'm a big fan of starting something, drawing some lines, getting some stuff out on the page, and then saying, all right, this isn't going to work. We're going to do something different. I do testing and analysis all the time on different kinds of designs, even simple stuff, to make sure that I am where I want to be and that I'm actually defining what should be there. But that's one of those things. Like I said, drawing stuff upside down, drawing stuff. Kind of closing your eyes a little bit and squinting, making things fuzzy and looking at them, doing a little bit of hand drawing on the art itself before you work, drawing in, like I said, in actual pencil before you try it, just to see what shapes are there, and playing with them is very helpful. And I think part of it is there's this combination of knowing the idealized object, what it should be, and then seeing what's there to make sure you're representing what's there accurately, and we can do something a little bit more. So it's something that I think is super useful. And like I said, old book, been around forever, but I still think some of it's useful. And I think some of the examples that are in there will help you get a better, also a better connection between your brain and your hand, which is useful for embroidery as much as it is for anything else. For digitizing is still drawing, no matter what method you use. And I think it's very useful to do some exercises with that, and also exercise in vector drawing. Super useful stuff. So Gina says, can you see me shaking my head up and down about drawing upside down? I can't see it, but I can feel it now, and I can certainly hear it from what you said there. Cindy, sorry she's late. You've been a customer. Hey, tune in for the rewatch anytime, guys. You can always get the replay on my YouTube channel, on my Facebook channel, or come see me at ericcampbell.com and find the tab, and the latest show will be there, and a link to the big playlist with everything from the Takeup. So you can come in anytime. Aaron is here. Happy to see you here. And Lori says, great book that was assigned reading for me as an art student decades ago. Yeah. And like I said, I don't have particularly art training. I've done my own training for myself. But the little bit I've done, that I think was a useful thing to look at. So worth taking a look at. I'm going to go back into what we were talking about. So what we talked about, drawing what's there, not what should be there. But the truth of the matter is sometimes we really do have to draw what's not there as far as there's poor quality art. So this really depends on the kind of work we're doing. Like I said, when we're doing photographic work, a lot of it is just getting out of our own way and not trying to add things that aren't there. When we're doing like graphical work, when we're doing logo work, text work, then we have some ideas that we have to deal with clean lines that aren't there. Or if we're doing the things like I like to do, which is adding dimension to something, we are maybe drawing lines that aren't there. And in that case, we're taking hints from the stuff that is there. So there's the mixture, right? And what I like to call this is the happy medium. You have to find the happy medium between what is there in front of us and what could be there once we're done embroidering. We have to look for the happy medium, the lines that are there, the hints that are there to show us what these shapes should be. And when we're dealing with just poor quality art, we have to look for the other happy medium, which is where we find what I call the kind of the color break. When we're looking at really bad raster art, art that has low resolution, art that looks poor, even if we're just trying to find where we should put colors in a particular design that doesn't have clear areas of color, we know that because thread is either on or off, thread is either there or not there, we're going to draw a shape and the thread will either be there or not there. Doesn't mean full density. We can layer in multiple densities. You guys saw that in my last show, and we'll see it many times as I talk about shading. But the edge of a fill, whether it's half dense, quarter dense, whatever it is, as far as the coverage, the edge of the fill, the last stitch in a fill, the outline of an object is always going to be solid. So we have to find that line. And the happy medium is to try and find where that line belongs. Now, I'm actually going to show you a little bit of some different pieces of art, right? And because I think it's useful to look at that stuff. First, we have the one that was, and I'll pop this up real quickly. In here on the right-hand side, this Road Devils art for a car club. we're actually going to talk about this because these are from my production line. Most of the stuff that I show you is from my actual production line, stuff that I did myself, done the way I did it for work. So I'm not just showing you kind of examples of stuff that may or may not be the case. I'm actually showing you stuff that is what I did. So we'll go ahead and start with that one, though. I'm certainly going to go back to some photographic stuff as well, because this is part of what we're discussing. But the first thing I'm going to do is talk about that particular piece, this Road Devils piece. And we're going to go through some of the stuff that I already discussed as far as how did I define that, right? So let's go ahead and pull up the second screen for a second, and we'll show you what I got for art. This was all of the art that I was offered for this full jacket back. Now, it's a simple piece. I would consider this to be a very simple piece. However, this is all the art that was available. No lie. When I was given this, this is all they had. There was no jacket in-house. It had to be done without any sort of sampling. It had to be done without any other materials. Now, luckily, fairly simple piece, right? This is not something that's going to break anyone's brains. I will say, though, if you're trying to figure this out, if I'm trying to draw on top of this, yes, I can read and understand from context that this says EST 1948. Established 1948. I know that because I just know a little bit about a little bit. So it's stuff that I just kind of intuitively understand, right? But when we're looking at this piece, the good thing is we can already understand a little bit about how we're going to handle it. When we look at it from further away and kind of not zooming in tight on the thing, we can say, all right, I can kind of see what this shape is supposed to be. It makes sense to me. I know what this text is. I can see this devil's head. I can see the rest of it. And I'm going to say, when I looked at it again, my piece is a little too regular in comparison to this. There is more variation in line width in this piece. What I will say, under the demands that I was time-wise, I elected to make it simpler than it is here and a little cleaner than it is here so I could do it quickly and so that I could make sure it looked decent enough on the actual jacket, right? But I'm going to say, all right, I already understood what I'm looking at here. I've got some text. I've got a central element here of this devil with the pitchforks, the devil's head. I've got text below, which is actually, here's the other fun thing, not the text I was going to be using. This is actually for a different group. So now I've got some stuff that has to be invented, right? But we can already see, I'm like, all right, what's the character of this thing, right? What's the character of this jacket? Well, the number one thing I can say is that this text, I can tell it's got some customized letters in it. Luckily, if you're like me and you like typography, you may have already known what kind of fonts we're working with here, what kind of typefaces we're working with here. This is why I kind of harp on about typefaces. If you do a lot of commercial digitizing, knowing the general character of typefaces will help you find source art. And even if it doesn't help you find source art or fonts, whatever you're looking for, when you need them, and like I said, you often don't, I wouldn't necessarily use them in this piece aside from the fact that I have to invent some new stuff. Knowing that typeface will help you to understand the character of the thing. I know that this is a black letter typeface. It's calligraphic. It's not like insular minuscule, not like the Age of Beowulf. It's later, but this is like what people often call Old English, but it's not Old English. This is a German style of black letter typeface. It's actually called a Fraktur. However, it's got decorated capitals that have these vertical lines that you don't see in all Fraktur fonts or Fraktur typefaces. You don't necessarily need to know all this to do the digitizing. Obviously not. What I'm going to tell you is knowing that stuff certainly was helpful to me when I'm starting to look for the other options for lettering when I have to put in something new that was not in the original art. But the first thing I can tell you is this. What's the most important part of this stuff? That's the stuff we talked about, right? The first rubric for kind of figuring out what I'm going to do with this poor artwork is what's important, what defines the art, right? These are the things I'm looking for. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is, because these are the initials of the club, I know that this R and this D absolutely are going to have to look right. They're going to have to look good. So no matter what I do, I'm not going to use a font to make these. I'm going to try my best to redraw this R and this D because I know that they're going to define the look of the rest of this thing. Also, I know that this is going to be a Fraktur font. It has to have the thick and the thin aspect. It has to have these straight linear kind of angles on it. It has to maintain those same angles in a calligraphic style throughout that font. It must look that way or it's not going to look right. They're not going to like it. So what I'm going to do on this piece, I'm going to probably draw most of this if I can. I'm going to draw most of it and make it straight. I know that the height of the O and A should be very similar. The E should be similar. I can see what the S is like. The other thing is, because I am me and I'm a lover of type, I know that this is a Fraktur font. And quite frankly, I know that this is very similar to a Fraktur font called Feta Fraktur. Feta Fraktur is pretty common. It's something that's been around, I believe it's from the 1800s. It was originally made as a metal typeface. I know that, I'm going to look it up. If not, though, you could still go to a font site if you were desperate to find a font and say, I'm going to look at black letter or calligraphy or old English style fonts. Those tags would probably bring up a font like this that's close so that I can get something just to help me see what I'm doing. So in this particular piece, I'm going to make sure I'm drawing that R&D as close as I can. I'm going to also look for that font that I know. And even if I wasn't with that specific font, I would say, all right, these tall things have this ball terminal. If I zoom in, you can see I've got a round little terminal here that's up here on that tail. I'm going to see that that's one of the things that's very iconic. These angles are iconic. The thick and thin nature of it is iconic, is part of what it looks like. It's got a nice round dot here. These are all important to the eventual design. So even though I can't see these things really clearly, I'm going to make sure any new font that I have to add, any new text I add has something very similar. It has that same weight and thickness. And when I rework this piece, I'm going to say I'm pretty sure that R and that D have been customized. They don't look like standard Fraktur fonts. They look like they've been added to or worked on. So I'm going to draw those whole cloth for sure, no matter what I do. And to be quite honest, I'm going to draw the letters in the name and then I understand that the other text, I can use fonts for stuff down here because as long as it's close, it's going to be okay because this is not exact either. And I know that I don't have to match anything here because those letters that I don't have, well, then I don't have to match those to the ones that I do have necessarily. I just have to keep the spirit of the original. So that's what I'm going to look at. Also, to be honest with you, when I zoom in here, let's talk about that happy medium again. I can see the edge. You're going to look at this piece, and yes, I know the edge is pretty rough, but because I know that this is supposed to be calligraphic, it has a clean edge on it, it's a font, it's a typeface, there's generally going to be a geometric kind of look to it. I'm going to say, all right, right here where I start to not get bright anymore, I see that we have this bright red, and then it starts to get into the black, the gray of the jacket. Right in here, there's corner. I can see a corner here. I can see a corner here. I can see a corner here. I know what those shapes are supposed to look like. I understand the way the font is built. I see that there's a straight line here. You can see that there's a fairly straight line. There's a curve to this. And I know because of the way black letter fonts are built, because of this angle, that that's the angle of the pen. Though it's imaginary, it's not a brush font. It's not a sans serif font. It's not a different kind of font. This thing has a pen that maintains an angle because it's like calligraphy. It's not perfect, but I can say this angle here should be very close to this angle here. And I don't have to be dead on, but this is enough for me to probably draw this. And I'll say it was enough for me to draw this. So when we zoom out, what you're going to see is I drew the letters that were there. Now, they're probably a little too perfect. I'll be honest with you. They're a little too standardized, a little too perfect. What I did do, though, is I looked at the font itself and said, all right, this is hand drawn. There are areas of this thing that have been done in a way that is imperfect. What can I do to bring the imperfection in, but still make it look like the original font? And I'll say this here is a much too perfect kind of angular O, but it is pretty close to what we're looking at here, right? I can see that I've got sharp corners. If I look at the color here, these corners are sharp. They're very obviously sharp to me. And when I look at some of the other pieces like this A, this has a little bit of a swoop to it. It should be more sharp, and it isn't. So I think that that's something that was drawn in, that's part of the character of the original, so I included a little bit of that curve as well. I'm doing my best guess with what I have. So what I did on this particular piece is I drew all of the pieces that were here, and then I brought them all up here and lined them up on a baseline to kind of get an idea of what I was working with. And as you can see, what I really worked on the most were this big R and this D, and I tried to make them look as much like this. I went ahead and used the original and drew them, but what you're going to notice is this is the original chunky drawing that I did. The original kind of chunky, rough drawing that I did is done, number one, it's done in pieces. I didn't worry about just drawing the whole piece. I drew each stroke almost like I was digitizing. Not exactly, because this is one piece, which it wouldn't necessarily be in digitizing if I was doing this as satin stitches. But I just drew my little pieces. I worked them out as best I could. And by the way, I set my points where they need to go, and then I edited the points thereafter. That's another thing. Don't be afraid to edit. We're drawing in vector. We're drawing in embroidery objects. We can edit. We can pull handles. We can change things at any part of the process. So drop points in and make sure they work. Make sure that you've got your cusp points where you're going to have sharp points that turn into curves thereafter. If we have a straight line, we can have straight line points on both sides of that, so it maintains literal straightness from one point to the next. And like I said, we're working in vector software. We can always go back in here with our software and we can grab points, edit, and make things work. And honestly, it's not super clean. Why? Because I'm going to draw this shape again for embroidery later, most likely. This piece, I may have used something different. And you'll also see that when I went to perfect this for my final piece, I cleaned up those curves a little bit. You know, I didn't use exactly the curves from my first drawing. I cleaned them up a little bit. Are they still a little rough? Absolutely. They're rough like the original. but I did absolutely look for some of the stylistic parts of this and work them out. So that's where I started to get that, right? And where I ended up eventually, and we'll go ahead and see if we can grab, we have multiple PDFs here that I'm looking at. So let me grab the actual PDF with the redraw. This is what we ended up with. So here's my text redrawn. What you're going to see is I had to change this text. Well, now I used a font here. I used a similar font. The only thing I did that was different was I added the vertical line. The original Feta Fraktur font that I used did not have this vertical line detail, so I added that. The other thing I did was I knew I had a D. We were doing Duke City, which is a name for Albuquerque, because named after the Duke of Albuquerque. So Duke City is the chapter. I went ahead and used the D from Devils in Duke City, even though the rest of these letters come from a Feta Fraktur font. They are no longer hand-drawn. These are font letters. Also, I used a drawn C. However, because I had these vertical lines in the other piece, you're going to see that I added a vertical line detail into the C that didn't have one and made sure that it had this hook swash detail from the other letters. So now it matched in. What have I done here? I've decided what defines the art, and I've used it to make my piece. So when I'm inventing pieces and when I'm analyzing pieces, that's the kind of work I'm doing. Yes, that is somewhat design work, but it does help to kind of look at what we have, look for that happy medium. So the point where your colors start to break and change, you can see where the lines are, you look for sharp corners and points, you look for angles you can identify, you draw from there, and then the other thing you do is you standardize. Especially with text, the thing to look for is you're going to say, all right, I have this width for my pen stroke. If I were drawing with a pen, it's about this width. I'm going to take this one letter that I've drawn. I'm going to go to all these lowercase letters and make sure that this stroke is about the same width as it is in the O. The O, the A, the D, the E, the V, they're going to be close, because if I can't tell how close it is in the art, but I can tell it should be, most typefaces are going to have a very similar stroke weight throughout. I can use that size to say on each letter it should be about this thick, and it helps me to get that done. Now I know that's it looks like a fairly extreme thing, but I don't think it's all that difficult. So I think that that's really what it should be. It's not that you're going to redraw everything, but when you're dealing with really poor art, or like this piece, I had to invent stuff. This stuff was not there. And if you look at the EST, like I showed you guys earlier, this area here, if I zoom in on this, it turns out that they changed their style a little bit. This is not the style we're working with. I went with a style that was closer to the rest of the typeface. But this thing is mush. If I try and draw this, I could get close maybe. I could make something look okay, but I'm going to be inventing most of it anyway. In this case, it makes more sense for me to jump over and say, all right, I'm going to go ahead and find a typeface that works. I'm going to make it look clean. I'm going to use the same style that we're dealing with the rest of this piece, and then I'm going to digitize from that. What I will say, looking at this now, I used monoline kind of single width stuff in the Devil's Head. If I were to do this again today, I would probably go back and add more variation, because yes, it looked clean in the eventual finished piece, but I think that probably is it looks a little bit too much like a neon sign version of this Devil's Head. And like I said, under the gun, trying to do it fast for a job, I certainly went ahead and went with it. But you can argue that I went a little too simplistic on the Devil's Head, and I probably should have used some satin widths that were different as I went through. What I will say, though, is it turned out clean, which when you're coming from that original art, there's a degree of saying, if I tried to reproduce exactly what I'm seeing here, I'm going to have mush. It's not going to look great. I have to decide that there are teeth here. I have to decide that there are teeth here. And so I would say that, maybe I went a little too simple, but I got the things that were important. And by the way, what makes the character of the teeth here? He's got a little snaggle tooth here, and he's got a sharp fang up here. That snaggle tooth defines that grin. So once again, I'm defining the grin. I'm defining what's important, certainly. So standardizing, yes, and I may have done too much standardizing here, but up here in the text, the standardization makes it all look good and continuous. It makes it look like one piece that is meant to be that way. So you find the happy medium. Once you do it, you standardize. You identify structures, which we can talk about more in realistic stuff, but you do identify structures. You identify the stroke widths. You identify, hey, the teeth, the eyes, the horns, the hairline on the devil. These things all have to be identified. So the little devil's head does require you to identify structures as well. And then there are other things that will be helpful for things like this, especially logo work. Knowing a little bit about typefaces is useful. It's useful because it means that I could identify the typeface quickly. It's like there's another piece here that I did a redraw on that I'm going to show briefly, and we're not going to go super deep on this one. Albuquerque Ambulance Service. As you can see, I didn't even bother with redrawing all of it. This is all of the art I had. This is a faxed image of an original piece. And this is back in the days of faxing, yes. So this is pretty bad. But photocopied, I believe, faxed image, so it was pretty bad. I don't know. This might be too much color depth. It might be a scan or something. But it was a black and white image. Was not very well made. The good thing about this particular piece is I knew from the very moment of looking at it that this is a font called Eras, Eras. And because I knew the quality of the font, that this R looks that way, that this C looks that way, I identified the font very quickly and I redrew it by just dropping it in. All I did was, I know I've got something, once again, if we look at this piece here, if I zoom in on this particular piece, the Star of Light that's here, if I tried to redraw that Star of Life as it is, it's warped. It's been warped by pull and push compensation. If I draw it like this and I digitize it exactly as it is and then I run it like this, the warp will increase and I will get more distortion than I already have here. So I'm going to just redraw that in an idealized fashion. The good thing is I can very easily draw an idealized version of this with like 3 rectangles that I, smash onto each other with shape building. And honestly, I know the font, so I'm just going to go ahead and drop that font in there and work from there. So luckily, that's what knowing typefaces can help you. The other thing that can help you quite a bit is understanding vector building. And by vector building, I mean the way that I would take 3 of these rectangles and rotate them a certain degree to get what I want out of this shape to make my Star of Life. Vector building is important in that we can understand things like how we make a border around something by using a contour or inflate tool. And the other great thing is a lot of software like Stitch Artist does. Stitch Artist 3 has an inflate tool and has vector operators. Things like what would be considered the Pathfinder in Illustrator. We can take 2 squares and either smash them together, cut 1 square from the other square. We can make an outline around all of them. We can smash them together and then cut out everything that overlaps and get rid of it. There are multiple things we can do that are shape building, and understanding vector building can also help us quite a bit to quickly render a piece of art that we're missing or that is in poor condition like this. Luckily, if we know what a Star of Life is, we can see about the ratio between the arms and how tight this inner portion should be. It's not too hard for us to build this thing out of 3 rectangles and rotate them. Also, I can't tell you enough how very, very, very simple geometric knowledge will help you in building things like this. Certainly, there are tools out there in particularly, let's say, like in Stitch Artist, also in Enthusiast, in the world that I'm in Brilliance world, it has something like a carousel where it will say, place an item, this many items around a circle evenly spaced. The thing is, if I don't have that, or if I only want one item offset from another item, one of the things you should know is basic angles, like that there are 360 degrees in a circle. If I need 10 items that need to be equally spaced, then 36 degrees of rotation between each arm or each object will then get me those 10, the 10 segments. Knowing a little bit about that will help you immensely. Knowing the opposed angles of something, so that if something's at 45, then you have a 135 on the other side. Super, super basic stuff. A square has 360 degrees also. So any square rectangle, you're going to have all those 90-degree angles. If you have a triangle, it's going to be composed of 180 degrees. So no matter what those angles are, they're going to add up that way. These things can at least help us sometimes to figure out positioning when we're doing building like this. It's very geometric. So knowing a little bit about that is also useful. So identify your structures and understand that. Know typefaces, and then like knowing vector building. And I'll show you another rework piece very briefly. And this is just where we had kind of poor quality. Now, I've already got text on top of this, and I'll go ahead and admit that I didn't pull this back apart for you guys to see it, but I've already dropped some text on top of it. Once again, greatly to my luck, I understand immediately from knowing typefaces pretty well that this is Arial, because this leg on a Swiss style font like this is going to be Arial, and it's in all Windows installs. So it's good to know those basic fonts that are going to be on everybody's computer, because that's often what people are building with. It's like Myriad is one that's built in with Adobe, and so people using Adobe often use Myriad as a base, and it's something that even our block is based on Myriad in Brilliance. But if we look at this, I can see, all right, how am I going to build this thing? And admittedly, it's a monster. I'm going to change things because it's not going to work very well in embroidery. But because I understand how this was built, quality is kind of rough, and I know I'm going to have to make changes to this piece in order for it to work right. Well, then I'm going to go ahead and make those changes in the vector first before I finish building it. I can say, all right, I understand how people make drop shadows in vector building. They're going to grab this piece and they're going to drag it down a certain amount, or they're going to use a shadow tool. I can understand how these outlines are based on the initial font here. They're used with inflation or contour tools that take the initial object and inflate while softening the corners as we get further out. And I can measure this stuff. And once, because I know that this was built in vector in this particular way, that I knew that it was built in such a way that we started from the font and then built out these equal these kind of contours away from the font. I can now take this font and add borders to it, add stroke width to it, add strokes to it, and add the width to them to make them thicker. I can use a contour tool to blow out the outer edges, and I can rebuild the elements I have in a way that makes sense for embroidery. So understanding vector building can help you with that. So in that case, that's where we do want to know a little bit about vector tools, and we might rebuild before we work in our graphic software, or work in graphic software before we work in embroidery software, depending on what our embroidery software has. And also, if our embroidery software does have contouring, it does have shaping like we do, then I can use that same tool to make this stuff happen from my initial outlines, even if, like I said, this F is going to be made out of at least 2 satin stitches. The R will be made out of at least 2 satin stitches, if not more. Even though that's the case, I can use this shape to do the building of all these shapes I don't have and to make versions that work for embroidery. So the final piece that we have on that one, and I believe I've got that here, this is what the original piece that I sent to them looked like. I eliminated a lot of the borders that were in it because it didn't add to the piece. It just made it ugly, lumpy, too thick, too dense. It didn't make it read any cleaner. So I explained that to them and I removed a bunch of those borders. However, knowing how they built the original let me quickly build the version that I eventually then digitized. It's now digitized in multiple shapes. It's not made with a single piece of contour. If we go back and look at the actual piece as it was, if we start to run through this piece, you can easily see that here are individual pieces of satin stitch that are inside of the filled area. And I believe actually, I don't think these are satins, individual pieces of fill stitch inside of the filled area that makes up that big palette of red, the border that's around it. And that then we have a satin stitch border that's going around the outside edge. We have the inner colors, the inner satins, and I believe I used a split or a length limited satin with an edge pad for these. And then we have the final borders. But as you can see, look at the little breaks in the objects here. And I'm going to bring this up larger because I know I'm going to run things on top. The same way I kind of talked about that analysis last time, I'm going to run things on top of areas I can absolutely stop and have elements that have breaks in them. You'll see right there at the bottom of that O, there's a break there. Why is that break there? Because I'm going to run the top of the F on top of it. I've talked about my layers and my sequence. We talked about that last week where we're going to build from the back to the front. Well, in this case, I wanted that blue border to be up at the front, and you can see how I'm leaving spaces for things. So I'm still not using the shapes. And if you see at the top of that I, what's going to go up there later is a little sparkle. So wait till we get there. A little sparkle will appear. And I actually did those last because I didn't want those to be in the same setup. I might have changed the color on these. They were debating back and forth between going ahead with the white and using like a metallic silver for those. So we had the little sparkles that are going in later, and I left room for them. But so I don't have excess density. So you can see I'm still not using the shapes that I made in the vector tool. The shapes from the vector tool, the original borders, the contours I used so that I have guidelines when I go to draw my embroidery shapes. When I want to make all these little internal pieces in that red, I'm not going to use the vector to do it. I'm going to draw those shapes again. The thing is, I just need to be able to make art that's intelligible, and I need to be able to make art to show the customer ahead of time what I'm going to do to their art to make it work, to make it viable for embroidery. So there we go. You see that I'm leaving all these little spaces. I have travel stitches. Those travel stitches are not represented anywhere, of course, in the art. Those are all the embroidery process. So even if I was converting a piece and I chopped it all up into pieces, I'm going to be drawing in all my travel stitches and stuff anyway. So I find that drawing these shapes is usually the best way to go. So once again, here we go, all the little internal pieces. And then, just like I promised, little 4-column sparkles and our final text underneath. So this was all built with the knowledge of how to do vector building, and knowing vector building is pretty useful. So I'm going to drop out and show you just a couple of other things that are, I think, formative for me, that helped me learn some things I think are valuable and may be valuable to you too. So I already showed you drawing on the right side of the brain, but I'm going to show you something else. There's a really cool challenge from a guy named Von Glitschka. Von Glitschka he's super awesome designer. And if you look at like lynda.com, or it's now called LinkedIn Learning, Some people's libraries, public libraries, university libraries will give you access. If not, these are things you can buy as courses. And this one I did many years ago. It's called the 21-Day Drawing Challenge. And Von Glitchka, who is an awesome designer, vector designer, and graphic designer in general, but great vector artist, teaches it. And this was great for my creativity, great for me to learn again to draw. It was 21 days of drawing prompts that I thought were super useful. So that was great for drawing. But the other thing he did that is incredibly useful, beyond useful, is a class called Drawing Vector Graphics, where he teaches you how to build a vector and how to use all the different tools in such a way that makes sense. Now, it's Illustrator based. I'm just going to tell you ahead of time. However, there are a lot of concepts that are in it that are worthwhile. So if it's something where you have it, especially if you have it for free, if you have it for free from your public library, like we do in Albuquerque, or if you have it through a university library or through another library, especially, watching some of the tools about shape building, that's his term for it, or how he uses Bezier curves if you're having trouble drawing in vector, watching this is great. Plus, like I said, especially you're in Stitch Artists, like a lot of you people are, because you've followed me from the Embrilliance family here. The tools actually have a vector, a Bezier-based editing method and format that will make sense to you through this. It will help you draw Bezier curves, which are pretty universal. Even softwares that use the spline method may have an editing method that's Bezier-based. And if nothing else, this is great for learning vector graphics enough so that you can jump into some software and do what I did with that text that was weird, draw some new shapes that you need, or draw the text so you get something clean to work from in your digitizing, so you're not just digitizing garbage on top of garbage and ending up with a garbage result. I mean, not every piece needs this. Things that have geometric precision, typefaces especially, may need this, especially if we cannot see enough to get them right in the first place. We're only close enough and we can't really tell what they're doing, or we need to invent new words, new letters that are not there, and we need to figure out what's going on. Then doing this stuff in vector graphics is great. Also, for doing layout, if we're having to make massive changes in order to suit embroidery. So these are all in the links list. Once again, Von Glitchka, he also has a book. There's like a vector drawing bootcamp book that he does. So if it's something you don't want to do the classwork, but you want to just see a book that he has done, look up Von Glitchka, VON. So Von Glitchka, it's in the link, so you can check it out from there. His stuff is really great to help you learn vector graphics. I certainly drew vector before him, but my vector got a lot cleaner after learning from Von. So Von stuff is cool. And then I'll go ahead, since I have told you guys to go do a drawing challenge, I'll show you my old drawings from my drawing challenge, so you can, number one, look at me looking unimpressed with myself in my self-portrait, which I've changed a little bit since then, a lot more gray than I had at that point 6 years ago. But this was one of my drawings from the piece. And if you go to that link, this link is in the links list, you can see all of my goofy stuff up to and including drawings of cats, weird monoline drawings that don't really go much anywhere, odd drawings of sketch sheets where we were filling in voids and areas with shapes, which I thought was very interesting. Drawing a hand in several methods, which I really enjoyed. Doing cardboard art, I like this one quite a bit, and I actually have made a couple embroidered pieces based off of this kind of weird sacred art style piece. And you'll find some of my favorites. This is one of my other ones that I really loved and I think taught me a great deal, and I'll go ahead and blow this up. This piece was how much iteration working toward a style matters. Redrawing this thing 3 times, I am not the kind of person who likes to do something several times, even though I told you guys to redraw things in embroidery. What I'm going to say is, in doing art, I often don't like to redraw, and I drew this piece from a reference image of a raven skull. But I wanted to end up with a mascot styled piece that would look really good as a patch. I've never finished making this piece over these many years. I didn't have a reason to, but I keep on thinking I'm going to do it. This original piece, as you can see, as I kept redrawing toward my style, look how much cleaner, how much more to a purpose this piece was, and how much more vector-like this piece gets as I'm working my revisions toward the final piece. It's also totally fine to draw something in a sketchy style and then work on it in embroidery toward the finished style in the embroidery software. This particular piece was done in, in traditional media because that's what they expect you to do. One of the other great things we could do, by the way, also, he did shadow examples. How would we shade a face depending on the angle of the light? And this stuff, like I said, all really valuable stuff that I thought was interesting and I think is worthwhile for everybody to take a look at. I'm going to be the first to say that I did not do the best job of all this stuff. However, I think that over time, especially over the course of drawing once a day for every 21 days, I got pretty okay. I got my chops back for a while. let's say this being the first thing I did, and then by the time we got done with it, I'm drawing like this, not too bad. Not too bad. Just exercising your hand into doing it is great. Plus, later on down that year, and it's a piece that I've given away before. If you guys haven't seen this before, I wanted to do a piece for a holiday thing. It was supposed to be a stylish holiday piece that wasn't going to look like every other Christmas tree piece. And I drew this very random piece by hand before I digitized it and did the different textures on it in the embroidery side. And this is something I might not have done if I hadn't taken, Vaughn's class to get me drawing again. So I think that that's something that's worthwhile, but definitely look into the vector graphic side of this from Vaughn. Very important stuff. I think it's worthwhile to look at. Other things I'm just going to briefly show you is, here's that Fraktur font that I told you about. These are the Fraktur style. This is Feta Fraktur. And you can see from the example, I knew immediately, because it's such a stylish font, I knew what it was supposed to be looking like. However, you can tell that it's been changed and that the capitals are not the ones that are being used in the actual logo piece. And there's Eris, the other one that I identified from the piece before. So those are useful to look at. We're not necessarily done today. I know it sounds like I'm wrapping up, but those are the links that I wanted to show you as far as that's concerned. However, we do have some other stuff to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and grab a comment here real quick. Number one, DJ, I'm glad to see that you agree with me on this one. Glad to see I'm not the only one that draws vectors in pieces that convert well to embroidery. Absolutely. And I'll say this, sometimes you draw that vector to help you figure out what you're going to do in the embroidery. Yes, it seems like it's extra time consuming, but depending on the piece and how worthwhile it is to you, how much work you need to do to get it done, and honestly, what you're being paid to do it, it's often one of the only ways to get the best version of what you can do. And I'll say drawing in vector is also a way of thinking out loud, thinking out in the graphical space. So sometimes drawing either by hand with traditional tools, if that's the way you work, or drawing in vector can help you get closer to what you're looking for. And also, I find that by the time I'm embroidering, I want to rip and run. I want to draw my embroidery shapes. It's not a lot of decision making, especially, I'll be honest with you guys, if you're just starting out, this thing, I've used this metaphor before. It feels like the first time you ever drove and you're checking in your mirrors and you're checking your turn signal and you're making sure the brake is off. And when you back out, you're like, okay, my belt and this, and I'm started and I'm in gear and my foot is here and the mirror is here. And you're doing 50 things. But right now, any of us who's been driving for a long time, you jump into a car, you fire it up, you buckle your seatbelt, and out you go. And you're just driving. You're not checking, doing, looking, braking, turning, you're driving. And for me, digitizing became and is more like driving, unless I'm doing something that requires a lot of precision. If it's something that is going to be used at the size that I'm working at, it's not like I'm working on a new technique. If I'm just digitizing, it's driving. And when I want to drive, I absolutely am going to say, I want to know where I'm headed. I don't need to be trying to invent where I'm going. I definitely don't want to be learning the rules of whether I'm on the left or right side of the road before I, as I go. I'd like to know those before I go. And for me, that roadmap to my end goal is art that's pretty clean. It doesn't mean I always work from clean art. And quite frankly, with a time crunch on, I will do my drawing with my software and draw that happy medium line along that weird edge where it's fuzzy and I can start to see the color change. I will draw that line in digitizing software all over the place. But when I want something really clean, especially when I have to change the layout, especially when I have to have a customer work off my piece and say, yes, this is what I want, and when their original art is so poor that I can't make things out, definitely going to draw it. And like I said, from that one piece we were talking about, I'll bring it up one more time. If we go back to that Road Devils piece, there's nothing to say about this face aside from, yeah, I need to make sure from a customer that this is correct. I need to know what that's supposed to look like. And I'm a lot closer once I start knowing, I'm a lot closer here to getting a customer to agree with me what the face is supposed to look like than I would be here. There are certain things here that I just can't guess for sure, and I need to make sure they're correct before we move on. So I have to have the customer approve this, because this is going to be more like what happens. And if we go look at it, this is what I ended up with. And now I'm going to admit, because it was so large and I was concerned about durability, this piece is about 16 inches wide, I believe. It's really quite large. The final piece was, this one might not be scaled to that size. I went ahead and went with some curved fills with satin stitch borders to keep it tough. Even on the smaller text, you're going to find that I used length limited or auto split satins, depending on your software, with edge padding. So that I still had kind of a satin type edge on it, but I had some stitch penetrations in the middle to keep it from all ripping loose. And as you can see, this piece was actually done. It was so large, it was bigger than any hoop that I had. And so here are some nice registration marks that are in this piece. And it was actually done as a top half and a bottom half. And the bottom half has my new invented text that I had to create. And once again, I copied over that D that made sense. I made the C look more like the rest of the artwork, even though it's a little too clean. It's not quite the same style. It is really close. And you'll see that I had to change that style up. I did not use multiple shapes. And in this case, I'll be honest with you, in this case, I totally could bring my vector in and use it. Because when we're talking about bordered satins like this, especially if that border is okay to be a little bit thicker than the original art, I can absolutely then bring in vector and use it in this particular case. The thing is, even in this piece, you say, all right, you use the vector here. I can use this vector here, 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 here. Wait a darn minute. Look at city. The tail that's on the C is not just part of the rest of it. It is clipped off and it is a satin stitch. So even in something this simple, let's go back out and run into that C. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and get it where it's more centered in the frame here. We run that C and you're going to see that, yes, there's a fill here. But before the fill starts, what do we have? We get a satin stitch for that tail because just the two borders would be thicker than that whole tail if they were running together. So I ran the tail and the curl before I ran the rest. So what do we have here? Yes, we still have fill in all these other important places and everything else is bordered, but down to that thinnest portion, we went ahead and used a satin stitch for it. So even in this case, I'm not just reproducing the vector, even after I had kind of the license to do so because of the type of stitching I was doing. If it was an applique, or it's like this where it's a fill with a border on it, and it's okay that it's a little thicker than the original art, then we could use that, and that's cool. So I will go ahead and bring in a couple more comments before we finish up into the next segment here. First thing, Jeff says, I looked him up. This is talking about Von Glitchka. I looked him up after you talked about him last. I picked up his book. It's really good. Yes, it is. 100%. And if Von is out there, tell him Eric Campbell sent you because I know him pretty well. I know him online well enough that we've talked a few times. And what's really cool, actually, I have some notebooks and a pencil set and some other stuff that I won in a contest for that drawing because he thought that some of the drawings I did were cool that I turned in and that I had done something interesting with the prompts. So I was pretty happy with that. That's high praise from a designer who did everything from, by the way, do you like the Dungeons and Dragons logo? That's Von Glitchka. So we're talking about a designer that has chops that is being used for major brands. He also used to do a lot of the design for things like, I believe it was Topps sports cards back in the day. Really big clients back in the day, and then went independent and has done a lot of cool stuff there too. So yeah, really good there. Now, and all the driving analogy, Maureen says, perfect analogy. Love to hear that stuff. Aaron, sorry, got to go. Hey, go on, check it out of the replay if you can. And if not, hey, catch what you can, see what you can, learn what you can, and get out. No problem. I do bonus time because people seem to be engaged when the viewer count's still up and I still have more to talk about. I tend to do bonus time, but you guys can tune in for what you can and head out when you have to. This is here for you, and I'm not here to hold you hostage. I love it when you're here, but I'm going to talk either way. All right, guys. So let's kind of get into the last few parts of this. I'm not going to go too far beyond this. However, let's get a few more things out of the way because I think that it is useful. I am going to go a little further into bonus time, if not probably the full 2 hours. These are a couple of things I think that are useful. We ended up on understanding vector building, but of course the other part of it is, of course, understanding embroidery and the shapes that are based in these satin stitches themselves, as we've showed them here, or in any stitch type. Satin stitches I call out because it seems like there's a lot of trouble with breaking up things like lettering, breaking up borders, breaking up shapes when they're satins. Certainly fills are the same way. People don't always know how to extract areas. However, a big flat filled area is usually easier for people to isolate and understand they want to use a fill on it than how they break a satin stitch up into several different parts instead of trying to just define an entire area and fill it in. What I would say is understanding the nature of the stitches, like a satin stitch. One of the best ways to look at it is as if it were certainly a pen stroke. To think of a variable width pen, you can think of it that way. You can think of it like a brush stroke. You can think of it like a ribbon that stretches. But the thing to understand about it is it has two ends and it has two sides. And knowing that means that we can understand when we're building things that we want to build in strokes and build things in a way that is not complex. We don't have a shape that has projections and things sticking all off of it, generally filled with satin. When we have things sticking off of that stroke that has its relatively smooth sides and that has its ends, that we're maybe going to break that into a separate piece of satin stitch. And like I said, and I've said this a million times, I'm going to say it again, the silhouette of what we're trying to embroider is almost never the embroidered shape. The outside outline is almost never the shape we're going to draw in digitizing software to get our result. And I'll bring that up more. But certainly that's something we're going to cover a little bit more. I think it's a little simpler, but understanding embroidery and what it's for, what each of the stitch types does best will help you. Also understanding the objects that are in front of you. And we talked about this in developing an eye for embroidery, so we're not going to go too far into it. But it's something that I think is worthwhile to think about. And let's go ahead and bring up. I've got another PDF briefly to bring up. First thing, this is from my debating digitizing course that I did recently, and this is the kind of stuff that we think about. I'm not going to belabor it because it's in that course and we've talked about it before. But we're identifying different kinds of structures. We're looking at this crane, and you guys have known that I've done this piece, and you've probably seen it on the show before. This is the actual finished piece. Well, how did I decide where all these shapes go? I'm looking at body panels. I'm looking at the difference between the tread and the sidewells on the tires. I'm looking at these hydraulic rams. I'm looking at ridges and fixtures that are on this object. The rams are cylindrical. They have two sides and two ends. They're probably they have a shine and a shadow on them, which is natural to a satin stitch. They will look good as a satin or as a curved fill, depending on their size. Same thing with these ridges here. They're nice, long, kind of tubular shapes. They're going to be great for satins. But if they're larger, we can use fills for them. But we're certainly going to have the stitch angles that are across them in such a way that makes sense to the panels. Big flat areas might be fills. We might use satins here because we have this curve that's on the sidewalls of the tire, but we might use something rougher or flat for the walls, the tread of the tire, and we're probably going to do some outlining because we have little dark lines that have to be filled in. Could we do little nubs of different stitch types in here? We might, but in this particular case, probably makes more sense to outline on top of a filled area because of the size of what we're looking at. So looking at actual structures is always good. And when we're identifying these structures, whether it's lettering, whether it's a crane, that's what we're looking for. The finished size and the structure is going to make the difference. Plus, we talk about stitch types here. We know straight lines, manual stitches are great for line work. They're great for drawing little organic bits and pieces inside of something. They're great for making grass because grass is long and narrow and it makes sense for individual stitches or straight stitches. Lines less than 0.8 millimeters. We can use these kind of guidelines to understand what we're doing. Satins, thinner than 10 mils, larger than 8. Also, we can tell we've got our ends. Here are our open ends. Here are our two sides. They can take any sort of shape. They can curve, twist, and turn. But a satin stitch, no matter what you do to it, will have two ends and it will have these two sides. This is just the way a satin stitch is. It's how it's built. It's what it is as a set of stitches. So we can use them for things, like I said, hands, arms, fingers, noses, things that are cylindrical. We're looking for the edges of these things and we're building them out of satin stitches. We have satins here. We have ridged satins to make up. It's multiple overlap satins to make up this bangle. We have the fingers or satins. We have one big satin for the hand because we have a shine on the top, shadow on the bottom, which naturally comes from a satin stitch. Also, nice curved fills in the belly, curved fills in the body, curved fills in the face with some satin to a low density satin to make that nose more prominent. Satins are shiny, have shadow, have light. They're going to make things more prominent. Satin in the belt, curved fills in the legs because of the sizes. These are things we do because we understand the nature of the stitch, what it's going to look like. Regular fill patterns are going to look shiny. Organic, rough, random fill patterns are going to look rough and organic. They're going to look more natural, less shiny, even when they're in thread of a similar sheen. These are things we understand from understanding embroidery, and we understand these structures and how to break things up. Satin stitches, also photo reference. Same thing I talked about last week, same thing here. How do I tell how to break that ear apart from the rest of this area here? I'm going to look at a photo reference and see where the ear ends. I'm also going to take a note of, well, you can see the edge of the ear here. I can imagine this line continuing. I look at the photo reference and see what the lion looks like, even though there's a big dark area here. I might also use some photo tools, or something else I'm going to very briefly touch on. I will very likely, when I'm doing photographic realistic work, I will use color and contrast adjustment. I'll go into my software and do that. Or if I have too many colors and I'm trying to find the edges I'm looking to draw the shapes in, I will use what I call posterization. Depends on the software, I may call it something else, and there's other ways to do this. Posterization, there's actually a definition in the show notes in the links list. Posterization will actually reduce the number of colors that's in a piece. And I'm actually going to bring in an example of that to show you. This is this New Mexico Mining Association piece. Once again, I showed you guys this before, but this is something where it doesn't have a lot of color depth, so we can probably already identify some stuff. We have some high areas, we've got some low areas. The color depth is not incredible, but it does have a little bit of color depth. And right here's the final piece that I did. I only used two colors in this. I've got a brassy color and I've got a gold color on the top. I decided to make it really flat, really stylized, so I don't have a lot of that. I have the outlining aside from the two colors that are in it. Originally, I spec'd it for another color for a highlight, but I found that in having the highlight color and then having those two other colors closer together made it a little too muddy. So having that kind of separation between the colors was something that the customer liked better, and it looked a little more shiny. So if we look at this piece, though, we can see, all right, it has a fair amount of contrast already. I might use like auto contrast, something like that, and let it adjust the contrast. This one's already pretty well adjusted, but I can use something. This is, by the way, this software is Affinity Photo. In this particular one, I'm going to go ahead and go to the adjustments palette and say posterize. And if I posterize this piece, posterizing is going to reduce my color depth. And I can go ahead and use this slider, and you can already see what I'm talking about. If I go all the way down to 2 colors, there's that color depth where we really only have, or at least 2 levels of posterization. Yes, the colors are wrong, but we're starting to define edges. We can say, look at the edges of the highlight. We can see where those shapes are that are going to define that highlight. And we might not even use this art for anything, but it might help us just to see where the highlights are if we're having trouble making them out. We're having trouble finding these shapes. Using posterize can help you find those shapes. And as we go up, you'll see, as we go further on, this is pretty much the full color. This is enough steps that just looks the same as the original piece. But as we slide down, you'll see it start to reduce the colors, and it reduces that color depth, and we'll start to get some of the more dramatic colors. And about at level 3 here, I've got a nice dark color, I've got a highlight, and I've got a medium color. And for 3 thread colors, that might be enough to help us find the shape. Now, we're certainly going to work on our color gamut a little bit to make it look more like this, so it's not quite so crazy. But these shapes that are showing at about level 3 here, that can help us inform where those colors go, because we're working in a limited color kind of area. Now, what I'll say is you might look at this and say it's too stark, go up a little bit further, and you're going to say, even though I'm using 3 colors of thread here, I may use half densities of different colors along these edges and find my shapes that say, all right, in this case, I've got some areas here where even if I'm just using 2 colors, I might use light densities to describe a third color in between here. So it really depends on how you're going to execute it when you select your colors. But you can eventually end up where you see those shapes. In this case, where I just wanted a really stark highlight, and I'm using some of the sheen of the thread, which is not really showing in this flash photography version of this thing that I have here. The sheen of the thread is doing the rest of the work, but you can see where my highlight shapes come from. And frankly, in this particular piece, I actually converted it to show you guys the kind of way the vector shapes of it would go. We can see this is what the original piece or the finished piece looks like. And as we zoom in here, you can see how I've drawn these. I do have some light density here. It looks more dense here, but as we can see, the stitches fall in with the stitches below it, and the stitch penetration points allow for some shadows in here, and it makes it work out. And you can see, if you wanted to, you can also draw these in vector. And in some cases, you can also see that is a way to handle it. And that in this particular case, when I first worked it out, I was going to use that highlight. I eliminated the highlight and went with these 2 colors here, essentially. We went with different colors that had a higher contrast, but this was me working that out. I eventually did some work in vector based on that posterized photo to say this is what was important, this is what makes sense for my piece. And it's super rough vector. This is not vector I would print. I'm not printing this vector. I mean, it's rendered as a bitmap here, as I often did. But as you can see, I went and did some super rough vector just to give myself an idea of where these lines should be. And then the final clean work was done here. And I'll actually say this piece is an early piece of mine. I would do a lot more with stitch angles and stitch types in the background fill area on this piece that I didn't do at the time. If I were doing it again, I probably would. And even then, I would say that as far as the color and the representation of the statue goes, it's pretty good. It's a decent representation. I don't feel too unhappy with it, unlike some of my earlier pieces where I do feel unhappy with them. But I'll say that that's where understanding embroidery helps, and then understanding that we can use our tools when we're working with something that may be photographic or realistic. Once we've done things like, we've identified some structures, so we can see that I'm using structures like the thumb and the back of the arm. These are cylindrical structures, so some satin stitches are going to help out with that. But we're definitely going to say understanding our tools and working with some color management can help here. Adjusting our contrast, knowing the kind of colors we're going to select, working on contrast in the actual thread, and of course, like I said, posterization and developing a palette. The other thing I wanted to bring up very briefly on that is that people also ask me about developing a palette for gradients. If you've been in any of my gradient classes, I'll very briefly touch on it. When I develop palettes for that, this is one of the techniques I will use. If it's an even gradient, you can literally say, I want 5 colors space, 5 boxes along a line. that is the direction of travel from one color to the other, from the one color to the final color. And we can say, all right, if I define that line at every, these spaces, that it can help us to say, select those 5 colors and say, all right, that's pretty good representation of the colors that are there. If we otherwise posterize, like I did before, you can also posterize a gradient. And posterizing a gradient or looking at even a raw color like this, if you have bad raster art or if you posterize the art, you may find that there are thick stripes that are kind of identified as the main colors. These big wide stripes that are in here sometimes will show you good colors that you can use to build up a palette when you're trying to, analyze your art, and you end up with, pieces like that, where we actually do a pretty decent job of going through about like an 8-color gradient in a very small space. Selecting your color is important, but then, like I said, understanding how this is built. You guys are getting a preview of that class, I guess. You can see through posterizing, can help you see better what the art is doing. And then you can also do things like this, where when we know the gradient is even across the board, we can literally space out these colors and use that as an idea for your thread colors. Not necessarily going to be the thread colors you use, but it can help you when you absolutely have no idea. If you're really trying to like figure that out and you're having a struggle with it, that can absolutely help. So that's one of those things I think is worthwhile to look at, is processing your image, working on contrast, things like that can actually help you if you're having trouble seeing the image as you want. So there we go, guys. I'm going to go ahead and finish up and say that's probably as much as we're going to cover today. We have other stuff going on, but I think that is probably enough. I don't want to go 2 hours like last time. Hour and a half is a good one. I think we're going to start trying to peel it back to an hour, but we had so many questions that I thought was worthwhile to go over. Let's go very briefly again over the things we talked about today. I really prefer traditional digitizing. This just means bringing in our art and we're drawing our embroidery shapes. So the shapes we need for embroidery are drawing on top of the piece that we're working on. Vector rework, you can bring in vector and rework the shapes you need, but realize that you're going to be adding things for overlap, for underlay, travel stitches, stuff like that. Whether or not you save time doing this or effort doing this, it depends. It can get you some really clean lines sometimes, and it is a viable option. Just make sure that your art's coming in as you expect it to, and think about whether or not you're gaining, much over just redrawing, especially if you're making new shapes that you almost undoubtedly will be when you're making your actual embroidered art. What's important? Look at the art and think about what's important. What needs to be seen? What needs to be visible? What do people want to be in the final piece? What defines the art? What are characteristics of the typefaces of the art itself that absolutely must be there for it to look like itself? Is it like a very interesting font like we showed, that Fraktur font that has that thick and thin stroke, that has those ball terminals and looks a certain way, has a certain weight? When we're looking at photographs, draw what's there, not what should be there. We start to idealize stuff and we will bring things in that don't really exist. So stop, fuzz your eyes out, turn it upside down, take a look and see if you can see what is actually there in the shape, not what you think should be there when you're struggling with drawing something, especially when the art is really poor. When you're working with poor quality art, find the happy medium. The place where colors start to change, you'll see that there's a line. You can see the demarcation where we start to go off into the color of the base background behind it. Find that happy medium line and then use the cues that are there, plus your knowledge of things around it, of the fonts, of the structures that are there, to help you decide where to draw those lines. Standardize, especially when we're talking about typefaces, when we're talking about things that are supposed to be the same width. Well, grab a one piece that you draw cleanly and use the width of that stroke to define the widths of the rest of the strokes, like it in the rest of the thing. The lowercase letters, find one that is indicative of the height the rest of them should be, and set that height so that if you're varying a little bit too much because of how poor the art is when you're drawing it, that you have that height set. Copy and paste pieces of letters and pieces of objects that are going to be the same size and orientation, or same size and look in other parts of the design, because that copying and pasting increases the internal kind of fidelity and regularity of the piece. Identify structures that are there, no matter whether you're identifying pieces of letters or identifying pieces of the actual thing that's being represented. Identify those. Helps sometimes to know typefaces. It helps to understand how to build vector and knowing the tools that are involved in shape creation. So check out Von Glitschka's courses if you have a chance to. Understand embroidery. Know what thread, what things look like in thread, what sort of stitch types are the best for rendering certain objects, and lean toward them. You'll understand more about how to build a shape by knowing what stitch type makes the most sense for it and what kind of textures you're looking to do. Break it all down. Break it down to the elements that make sense for that stitch type. And remember always that the silhouette almost never is the embroidered shape that you're going to use. Maybe 4. Applique, fill areas that will have a border on them. Can you use those sorts of shapes? Most of the time, you're going to be building a shape, a letter, an object out of many, many shapes, not converting a vector that you bring in. Almost always, you're doing the best kind of embroidery you want. Working on photorealistic pieces, make sure you think about color and contrast adjustment. If it looks too muddy, look at what you can do for brightness, darkness, contrast, or histogram curves. Something I can't really cover a ton here, but think about color adjustment, and at the very least, hit the auto adjustment and see if it helps you see those lines any better. When you can't define areas in your color, use posterization. Look it up for your particular software. They're all going to have some version of it, and there are even online posterization tools. Use that to reduce the color depth, and it'll help you to define some edges if you're really having trouble finding where to find the edges of color in a photorealistic piece. And develop a palette. Select the colors you're going to use, and think of the final thread colors when you're thinking about this stuff, so you can get the kind of contrast and gamut that you want. All right, folks, with that, that is way into bonus time and hopefully something useful for you guys there. I would love to hear more about what you want to see next week. I believe next week we're going to dive into some marketing and some business stuff. So we're going to talk about some probably the ideal customer stuff that I promised you about 2 weeks ago. And it looks like we might have some marketing stuff that was asked for by some of the other reciprocators. So jump in. Comment on this, find me on social media, go to ericcampbell.com and message me there through the contact us page. Check me out there, and anywhere you are, go ahead and comment. Ask the questions you want to ask. I cannot promise I'm going to email everybody one-on-one, especially when I get floods like I did this last week. What I will do is take into account, answer you when and if I can, and definitely take it into account for topics later on the Takeup. So with that, guys, thank you for being here this Friday, and I can't wait to see you again next week.